Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We are glad that you are joining us for this conversation. If you haven't been with us, we're glad you're joining us. We are going through a series on the most famous set of laws that have ever existed, the keystone of Western civilization. We're talking about the Ten Commandments. And we are actually on the very last commandment. We did one lesson on just kind of an overview of all of the commandments, and then we've spent 1 week on each of the commandments. We are finally to commandment number 10. This one is do not covet, but there's a lot here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's go to the scripture. We'll read Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, and then we will start off with our conversation. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Okay. Jeremy, do not covet. What does it mean in our current context, and why do we start here?
Well, what covet? We need to start with what.
Sorry, why do we end here? I should
coveting.
say.
Start. What do we? What's coveting? We need to understand that coveting is okay. This is not a situation where you look at something, a new car or a new phone or something. You say, man, that's really nice. I think it'd be neat to have one of those. And then you go on with your life. Okay. That's not coveting. Okay. What coveting involves is a desire that runs so deeply, and a desire that runs so becomes such a problem that you would be willing to murder, steal, lie, commit adultery. Okay, you'll notice it says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Okay, that would be the heart attitude that would lead to the sin of adultery is coveting. Okay, so what we're dealing with the Ten Commandments, we need to remember that the Ten Commandments, while there are 10 of them in a list, they are one unit. And the 10th commandment it's the 10th one for a reason. We talked last week about the Russian nesting doll and how commandments 6 through 9 kind of start, depending on how you want to talk about them, start outside and get closer and closer to your heart. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, now we're at that little tiny Russian nesting doll in the middle that if you're not careful, you'll lose. Okay. We're all the way into the heart. Okay. What we're going to see tonight is we're going to bring a lot of threads that we've talked about over the course of this lesson series together, because this one says not only should you not do the external actions, and the external actions are often what we focus on, okay, because they're things we can see. We can't look into someone's heart. God can, but we can't. Okay. We can't assume what someone is thinking, what someone is feeling, unless they give us some sort of clue or some sort of hint. Okay. So we focus on the things we can see. Stealing, adultery, lying, murder, all of those would be external things. And so we focus on making sure our external behavior is good, which is human nature. That's what the Jews did. Okay. By the time you get to the first century, the Jews were focused on what are we doing on the outside? Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not do this. I say unto you, you shall not have the heart that leads to that. Okay. Coveting focuses on what's our motivation. And I think it's interesting, and I would not go so far as to try to read Paul's mind from almost 2,000 years later, but I think it's interesting. In Romans chapter 7, he's talking about being released from the law. And he's got a section where he talks about he doesn't want to covet, but he does. And so he's got the spiritual man at war with the physical man, and if not for the law, he wouldn't know what coveting was. Okay. I would not go so far as to say that Paul had this commandment on his mind when he wrote that. But I do think it's interesting that the commandment that Paul uses to illustrate the challenge of taming the heart, not the physical, but the heart, is coveting. That's the one Paul says that's the one he says he struggles with. That's the one he says he has a hard time with. That's the one he says he really has to work to overcome. And it's interesting, the self-righteous man, which by that we mean the man who considers himself righteous, which Paul deals with that in Romans chapters 2 and 3. The man who says, he looks at himself and says, I'm a righteous man. And Paul says, no, you're not. You need Jesus too. You sin too. Okay. And later on, Paul comes back, and the sin he deals with is one that comes from the heart. Okay. So what we're dealing with is something that's on the inside, and that can be really hard to control sometimes. Okay. This is the one we probably have to work at the hardest. I've never had to work very hard to avoid murder. Okay. Which is probably good. But this one is one, especially in a society that is materially blessed as ours is. And we are, and we say it every Sunday, we are incredibly materially blessed. Well, one of the things when you are blessed with such abundant wealth, one of the problems you have is you tend to focus on physical wealth. And that can lead to coveting. Okay. So you've got this problem of a heart that says, not just, that's really neat. Boy, it'd be neat if I had one of those too. But the heart that says, I want that. And not only do I want that badly enough to violate God's law to go get it and to take it from my neighbor. See, I want it badly enough, not only where I violate God's law to get it, but I'm willing to take it from my neighbor so my neighbor doesn't have it either.
Yeah. Yeah. It builds on itself there. So I think, it's interesting, the inward nature of this. Because of its inward nature, there is no law. There is no legislative law against this sin. Whereas, thou shalt not murder, there's a law against that. Thou shalt not steal, there's a law against that. Thou shalt not bear false witness, there's a law against that. And at some points in human history, there's even been a law against not committing adultery. So, why is it that we can't have a law here? Unless we go into 1984 world, where we have thought police and people, look, and even then you can't look into someone's mind. So just to go along with the 1984 analogy, even if we had cameras in every room, even if we had facial recognition software like they do in China, to know, we couldn't know how someone was feeling. We couldn't know the inward thoughts of someone. So for that reason, only God is fully capable of keeping someone accountable for this, unless that person wants someone else. I can tell you whether or not I've been coveting, but only ourselves and God knows whether or not we are coveting. And this gets into the way that Jesus interprets the 10 Commandments. That every time Jesus looks at, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, he goes deeper into the law and looks at the heart. He's not inventing anything new. He's just applying commandment number 10 to what's being said earlier. So for us as Christians today, because God does not speak directly to us other than through Scripture to let us know that we should be aware of these things, because Jesus has already spoken directly to us. In order for us to be held accountable about coveting, we should be open and honest about the temptations that we have. This is why the Christian act of confession is so important. Commandment number 10, I would make an argument, and I'm just reviewing just to make sure that I think it's fair to say that other than maybe commandment number 1, commandment number 10 is the hardest one for our Christian brothers and sisters to hold us accountable for. So in order for us to develop as Christians, we have to be honest about the fact that the root of any of the sins that we have is going to be found in commandments 1 and 10, that we're putting some other God in front of the true God, and we're letting that drive our desires and drive what we find important in life. So in that way, it gets at the motives of what we're doing.
Right. It's very much an idea that our motive matters, not just what we do, but why we do what we do. Okay. And two thoughts along these lines. One, when we avoid coveting, we avoid violating God's laws that are where we're motivated by our covetous nature. Okay. In other words, if we can tame our covetous nature, okay, that's going to solve a lot of these other problems that we're going to have. Okay. And the second is our heart matters because we are supposed to have a heart like God. Okay. We are supposed to keep our heart in line with where God is. Okay. And if we are coveting things, if we are entertaining the thought of stealing from someone or murdering someone, okay, taking someone's life or murdering someone so that we can steal from them. Okay. Ahab and Naboth. Or lying, either lying to protect ourselves or lying to gain some advantage or lying to gain something, whatever we're doing, if we can control that thought, okay, then we avoid not only violating this commandment, but violating whichever one of the other commandments we were going to violate in order to go get whatever we were coveting. Okay. The other thing that I think is interesting in this, and Michael, you talked about the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus actually covers coveting later in the Sermon on the Mount too. Okay. When he talks about why do you worry about tomorrow? Okay. Why are you worried about all of these things? Okay. And Jesus is not saying don't plan, don't prepare. That's not what he's saying there. What he's saying is be content with what you have. Okay. And there's an idea of contentment in this commandment as well. And we've talked about contentment some. Okay. When we talked about stealing, we talked about commitment. Well, the 10th commandment heightens that, because what we're saying again, when we covet, is God, what you've given me, it's not good enough. I want more, and I want more so badly that I am willing to violate my created nature to be like you, to go get what I want. It's interesting. Philippians chapter 4, and of course we're all familiar with Philippians 4:13. We've referenced it before. A few weeks ago we did stealing. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and that has nothing to do with winning a playoff game in high school sports. Sorry. I mean, cool. If you win, great, but that's not what Paul's talking about in Philippians 4.
Did you ever win a playoff game in high school sports, Jeremy?
Like me playing or me coaching? Me playing. No, I did not. But that's a different issue. Anyway, what Paul is talking about in Philippians 4 is being content. He says in Philippians 4:10, I have learned the secret to contentment. I have learned the secret to being content if I have a lot, if I have a little. Okay. And the secret to that is trusting in Christ. Okay. And what an important thing to remember with Philippians 4, Philippians is one of what we call the prison epistles. Okay. Paul wrote it from prison. Now, he didn't write it from the Mamertine dungeon in London. He wasn't in a dark, dank cell with water dripping in bars and scratching out on little scraps of paper as best he could while the rats crawled around. Okay, hope you enjoyed whatever meal you've eaten before you saw this class. Okay, that's not the situation Paul was in. He was under house arrest in Rome. Okay, Philippians was probably written in the period referenced in Acts 28. Well, let's think about what Paul went through before Acts 28. He traveled to Jerusalem. There was a riot because people were spreading a lie about Paul taking a Gentile into the temple. He was arrested by the Romans. He was almost flogged by the Romans. He was put on trial before Felix. Okay. Felix was hoping to get a bribe out of Paul, so he left him in prison until Festus came. Then he had to tell the story again to Festus. And then he got on a ship to go to Rome. And on the way, the ship was shipwrecked. And he gets to Rome, and okay, he's in a rented house. He's still got a Roman soldier chained to each arm. He still can't come and go as he pleases. He's still stuck there until Caesar gets around to hearing his case. By the way, the Caesar in that case was Nero. Okay, so that's the situation Paul is in. And that's what Paul has gone through the preceding 3, 4, 5 years. That's the backdrop to where Paul says, I'm content with what I have. Okay. And that's the backdrop where Paul says, I'm content because of the power of Jesus Christ. Okay. Contentment is about faith. Covetousness is the opposite. Covetousness is where we look at God and say, God, what you gave me, it's not enough. I'm going to go get more.
Yeah. I like the dual nature of what you're setting up there, that there's a choice that we make. There is a choice that we make between being content with what we have. You're one of my favorite sermon series on Philippians that I've ever heard. The title for the entirety of the series was The Rebel's Guide to Joy. The idea being there that it is countercultural, if not counterintuitive, at least countercultural, to be joyful in times of persecution and in the really hard times in life. And personally, I will say this: I'm often covetous when I'm doing really well. In the good times of life, that still seems to be a sin that sticks out, and I think that that's actually one of the tricky parts, or one of the devil's weapons there, is that this covetousness works all the time. It's very difficult to remove yourself from a place in life where you're not looking, where the grass isn't greener on the other side. So for that reason, we are called to not to enter into a different part of life. Like the answer isn't something that I can do. I can't improve my life, or I can't give away everything so that I'm now not covetous anymore. There's nothing I can do to get me there. And it's reminding me in Psalm 86, depending on your translation, David says either give me an undivided heart or unite my heart. So there's this idea of a bifurcated heart, like, not just the valves that are there, but really that we have a heart that is split between our two loves. And yes, we say that we love God, and I'm praying about the thing that I want for God. God put me in a place where I can serve you best. But when He puts me in a place where I can serve Him well, it's that very gift that He has given to me that drags my heart in the other way. Not because of anything God has done, but because I have allowed the sin of covetousness to come into the blessing that God has given to me. So our constant prayer is, God, give me an undivided heart. God, unite my heart to be fully content with what you are giving me. And then once He's given it to you, the prayer has to continue. The prayer has to go on so that we continue in that mindset, because usually it's when our circumstances are changing. You know what? It's when our circumstances are changing. It's when they're not changing. It's all the time. If we're not praying that prayer, we will be drug away by covetousness. And it's really hard to escape that by our own strength without intervention on God's part.
Yeah, I think the idea of being dependent on God is in many ways the core of contentment. Okay, we become content because we recognize that God's strength is enough to get us through, and what God has given us is enough to get us through. Okay, and the idea of having a mind and a heart for God. Okay, it's interesting. Earlier you were mentioning that this commandment and the first commandment, okay, and how they play off of each other. And in many ways, the 10th commandment rolls all the way back around to the first commandment, which was we've talked about. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, that's idolatry. Well, when we covet, what are we saying? We're telling God we're going to do it our way to get what we want. Okay, or and here's what's interesting: even good things can become a source of coveting. Okay, even you say, we pray, God, put me in a position to serve you, and God does, and we become wrapped up in the service that we've been given, and we begin to sometimes say, well, wow, I'm really, really important to the kingdom, and this service is really, really important because I'm doing it. Okay, and people look up to me because of this service that I'm doing. Okay, and eventually the service God gives us becomes an idol. Okay, because we're coveting, the praise of men, or whatever is driving that. Okay, we've lost focus. See, with covetousness, what we're doing is we're telling God, this, whatever we're coveting, is more important than what you want for me or what you have given me. And what's more, I think I need that so badly that if you don't give it to me, I'm going to go get it anyway in my way. So we're putting our judgment before God's judgment. We're putting our desires before God's desires. In addition to, we're putting whatever we're coveting in the place of God. So in many ways, the 10th commandment is the first commandment applied to life. Okay. You want to know what it looks like to have some other God in the place of God. Coveting. That's what it looks like. Okay. It is something that you desire so badly, you will put it before God. It can be and it can be something that is in and of itself good, but if you put it before God, it's idolatry. Okay, so the two commandments, and you've got the first commandment and the 10th commandment, the beginning and the end, and they work very well to kind of pull the whole thing together, saying, look, God's priorities are first. God's provision is first. God's judgment is first, and don't put anything else ahead of that. Have a heart, okay, and an interesting side note here, the ancient Hebrews, they didn't associate emotion with the heart. They associated what we would call the mind with the heart. Okay. So in the Old Testament, when it talks about have a heart for God, what it's talking about is having a mind for God. Okay. And that's a decision. That's a choice. It's in like you said, we're going to go through time periods where we struggle with it. Although, like you, I find the times I struggle with it the most are when I'm doing well. Okay. It's the times that I'm struggling where I'm reminded more that I need God. Okay. Kind of makes me wonder if sometimes we go through struggles so that God can remind us that he's there and we need him. Almost like struggle is designed to help us grow closer to God, but that's a different lesson series. Anyway, it's a struggle, and it's a constant battle we fight, but it's a battle we have to remind ourselves, I need to be focused on God. And if I want to do this, or if I want this thing, or if I want to do this thing for the kingdom and God says no, or God says not yet, I need to have a heart like David. Okay. Not David and Bathsheba. That's coveting gone too far, way too far. Okay. But a heart like David, where David went to God and said, God, I want to build you a temple. And God said, no. And David said, okay. And he made provision so that Solomon could build a temple. He didn't go try to do it on his own because it was a great thing and David wanted to do it. And David wanted to be remembered as the temple builder. He stepped back and he said, okay, God, you told me no. I want to do it, but you said no. So I'm going to prepare for the time when you say yes.
Yeah. The humility and the response that we have has to mirror that of David. That what God is preparing us for when he is giving us a content heart, when he is taking us away from the covetousness, will be difficult. It's not something that it's something that will be rewarded, but the reward is not what we were looking for to begin with, right? So in order for God to make us what he wants us to be, he has to remove the other God. I'm not saying, it's not going to be the down, if you were being covetous with your family, that you were putting your family above God. He's not going to take away your family. He's not going to take away your job or whatever it is. But there does have to be a cataclysmic change in your life. There does have to be a reordering of priorities. And for David, it was removing the one thing. I hate to say this, but this is my armchair theologian or armchair Bible scholar thought. David didn't care too much about Bathsheba. He obviously didn't care too much about his kids. He didn't do a very good job on that front. He wanted to be the building king, right? If he would have been able to build the temple, that would have been the biggest thing in his life, right? To be known as the king that had built the grandest building in the history of his time, at least, if not for hundreds of more years. So it really was God taking away the one thing that perhaps David would not have been willing to give up, right? I think with Bathsheba, with the child that died from that relationship, that those were temporary gods, but they weren't something that kind of transformed his character in the long term. And perhaps God knew about David that building the temple was not something that would have been best for him, even though David said he wanted to do it for God. My thought, just throwing that out there. So, okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. Let's get into closing comments. Jeremy, covetousness, it seems to play a large role in the entirety of the 10 Commandments. How do we as Christians respond to this commandment? How should we think about it today?
Well, just kind of to bring it all together, we've mentioned the term. You said last week it's a Latin term that's almost become English. Imago Dei, made in the image of God, and maybe you're thinking, okay, we get it. We're made in the image of God. The horse is dead. Put the stick down. But this Imago Dei is the core of who we were meant to be. Okay. If you've ever had that existential question, why do I exist? You exist to be in the image of God. Okay. Ultimately, all of the commandments stem from this fact. We are made to be in God's image. We are made to have the character of God. Okay. And you think about, we say it all the time, sin cannot exist in the presence of God. Okay. And sin is anything that is contrary to God's nature. Okay. God defines sin. Sin is what God isn't. Okay. So thinking just about all of that and this idea of covetousness and just the idea behind the whole 10 Commandments. This is designed to help us build a character. And we've used that word before, and our character really does matter. Okay. What's the saying? Character is who you are when no one's around watching. Okay. Character is who you are in the deepest, darkest recesses of your mind. Okay. Character is who you are when they wake you up from anesthesia and you don't know who's in the room. Okay. That's who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to have the character of God. God is truth. It's not just that God doesn't lie. It's that lying is completely contrary to who God is. So if we would have the character of God, not only would we not lie, we also, no matter what the situation we are faced with, we would not even entertain the thought that we should lie. Okay. Indeed, the closer we get to the character of God, and understand this is a process, this is growth. Hopefully we're closer now than we were earlier in our life, and hopefully we're nowhere near as close to where we'll be later on in life. Okay. Okay. And it's a hard standard to live up to. But when we're confronted with a situation where we might lie or we might steal because it would make life easier and no one's ever going to really know, and we're confronted with a situation where a more worldly person would think, I could lie, but I won't. The idea of lying just doesn't even cross our mind. we don't even think about lying or stealing. Okay. Let alone committing murder or committing adultery. It's just, it doesn't enter our thoughts. Okay. That is the character of God. To have a character like God will kill covetousness, because covetousness is about the heart, and our heart will covet less the closer we get to God. So as we think about this, who is God? What is God's character? That is the character we aspire to. And the 10 Commandments, as a unit, the 10th commandment by itself, are designed to help us build a character like God's.
Well said. The aspirational piece of this, that it is about character formation. I think that's a good thought there. One thought that I will give is it's purely based off of length of the verse. Look at verse 13, 14, 15, 16. As we're going through all of these, don't do this commands, very short, very direct and to the point. And yet, when God is giving us this don't covet command, he gives us a list. Neighbor's house, neighbor's wife, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, anything. And then ends it off with anything that is your neighbor's. I think God is aware. I know God's aware, but I think this is where the verse is going. God is aware that we're going to try to weasel out on this one. That we're going to say, well, I obviously don't murder. No one can get me on that. I don't commit adultery. I don't steal. And I don't lie in court. I'm pretty good. And yet we won't hold ourselves up to the high standard that is set by the first commandment and the 10th commandment and all of the above. That when our actions are hidden, we won't have that character that you're speaking about, Jeremy. I think that God, in putting the length there, is saying that this can happen anywhere in your life. And so the expansive nature here is it can't be captured in a short sentence. It's God saying, hey, let's broaden this out. And in that way, it should convict us that we are constantly going to be in a battle to keep the King of Kings on his throne in our own life. He's already won the war. We're fighting our daily battle to keep him there. So, Jeremy, I've enjoyed this series. I think that it's been good to take an extended look at each of the commandments. And so hopefully everyone who's been a part of these conversations has been enriched by it as much as we have. So we say it every week. We hope that somehow we are back together all in one, in Bible classes and everything, as soon as possible. But until then, we will continue to have these classes here. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.